So a couple of weeks back, I done a video on Gojo, which was more so a hypothetical surrounding the return of his character and the most likely massive impact that it will have. But today I wanted to specifically focus on Sukuna, kind of the interest there is towards him, more so for the end of the story. Because at this current point in time, the amount that not only Akutami has played upon him, how much he kind of lurks within the background, how he never realistically loses in a sense. He always finds some sort of gratification or some sort of winning point, even if he does lose. It leads me down this path of uncertainty for his character by the end, more so towards the final fights, the final interactions, and the finale in general. Where does he go? What happens to him? Does he die? Does he fight against some of the most powerful people within the story? Does he get fully resurrected? Are we leaning towards that path currently? Will the Culling games give us a brand new perspective of what Sukuna is truly capable of, or will it spiral into something else entirely? This is the greatest thing that Sukuna adds to the story, and Akutami has done an incredible job in not utilizing him to the fullest, which leaves this very purposefully mysterious window where you don't know what he is capable of, what he could truly do, and how he could be fully played upon. Where it starts is how Sukuna is weaponized as a deity or a being or a demon or a devil inside of the main character. This in itself, I guess you could equate to being an archetype for a character. A lot of main characters have this inner power, demon, devil, etc. that is within themselves, that is a completely different person, that is potentially one of the most powerful beings within the story. And it creates a very odd perception. It creates this chosen one identity at the beginning of the story. It creates this lingering power scale. It creates this influence or relationship between the main character and the being inside of them, and overall the power that they could eventually obtain. Now, majority of what I just said is pretty standard. There's nothing inherently wrong with them, but a lot of people may not fancy that general approach. I think it's very not necessarily difficult to do inner beings or inner demons nowadays, but because they have to somewhat follow a specific path, the amount of detouring or curveballs that you can do is very limited, especially because they are stuck within the main character. A lot of the progressional points or moments or interactions, whatever it may be, has to be pushed through the main character as well. So already you're going to have them interact. You're going to have them form or build some type of relationship and some type of agreement. In some way, shape, or form, you're also going to see the type of power that they can bring out and how overwhelmingly strong they can be. It's probably the biggest reason why a lot of the stories that have main characters with inner beings focus more specifically on the mental health of the main character, the emotions that come through and the thought process that genuinely gets affected. Instead of the power struggle between them, it's more of a mental struggle, an emotional struggle. What length that actually gets played upon, however, varies quite drastically. And Akutami has decided to use this as the kind of go-to point of contact, but in a very backwards type of way. I wouldn't say Sukuna is different from these archetypes, but I would say Akutami's approach to the archetype is backwards, very purposefully, not something that is just fickly finessed through with grace and luck, but with purpose, with intent. The first thing that's implemented that somewhat catches your attention is the power dynamic between them. Sukuna is not of full strength. The purpose of the story is Yuji finding the rest of Sukuna's body and ingesting them, becoming more powerful each time he does. Yet even then, it's not a drastic shift or change in power balance. If anything, Sukuna doesn't change all too much, neither does Yuji. Normally, your thought process would go down the path of thinking that each finger that Yuji obtained would be this massive boost in power for such an incredible godly being. This isn't necessarily the case, and this is the first kind of backwards attempt that Akutami does to show you that as powerful and scary as Sukuna is, these fingers aren't really going to change all too much. It's definitely going to give him more power, but it's not going to jump him into a whole different mindset or jump him into this eclipsing power that's going to overthrow everything. From the first finger all the way to potentially the second last one, Sukuna's pretty much going to act the same. He may show off a little bit more power here and there, but for the most part, it's through and through the same. And we get to see that firsthand. There is a very tiny bit of a scale for it, but you could easily hide that behind his appearance within the story. He actually doesn't appear all too often. So you set this kind of process of elimination up, thinking in your head that Sukuna is going to get more powerful, and yet even with all the fingers that do eventually get eaten, he still doesn't drastically change. So already your perception's a little bit unsure of what he's doing or what's going on entirely. But then his appearance within the story drastically reduces. And for me, this is the biggest indicator of Akutami handling Sukuna more so within the background and not making him a focal point. There's two ways that this works extremely well. First is the unknown that Sukuna brings. He is a character that works on his own mindset. He never really makes offhanded or one-sided deals that is against himself. He's extremely intelligent and genuinely doesn't care, which is the most lingering thing when it comes to his character, is that he genuinely does not care about a lot of things. So all of this pleading and all of this desperation that Yuji may bring across, asking for this power, asking for his help, he will say no in a very menacing type of way, in a very evil type of way, because that is the character that he portrays, a very evil and devious individual, and he uplives it to the fullest through and through. It doesn't waver, doesn't devalue, it's consistent. Because of that, it enhances the element of the unknown. Very unpredictable. So whenever he is talked to within the story, whenever he does make an appearance, you don't know what he's going to do. This might sound super simplistic in comparison to other stories, but not a lot of other stories tend to build that disconnect from their main character to the inner being that is inside of them. The reason for that is that you don't want to have this jarring discourse or identity crisis between your main character and the inner being. Normally they would grow together, and Akutami still does this, but more so just with the fingers. Everything else, however, they keep within the background. The second thing is how Sukuna's unpredictable nature and his emotions to cause so much havoc and destruction genuinely affects the main character. It affects Yuji. In the more so halfway point of the story, you see Sukuna's kind of true, I don't want to say purpose, but the way he deals with people in very desperate or mentally exhausting situations. He enhances it. He kind of thrives within it. Any sort of mental or emotional problem that Yuji may bring across, Sukuna will weaponize it and throw it out of control. He will throw it out of order, which sparks or spirals Yuji in a very interesting direction. This is Sukuna having direct influence over the main character without actually having access to him, whereas a lot of other stories would do the opposite. They may genuinely affect the main character when they have access, or they may be completely dormant and not do anything to play lingering doubt within the main character. This escalates drastically throughout the story, and then you get to a point where the destruction and the power that Sukuna brings across, Yuji can't comprehend. And it's at that point that he finally realizes that Sukuna is well and truly out of control, that Yuji does not have the reins over him, that this whole time where Yuji thought that Sukuna was just inside of him, that he could keep him in this position and keep kind of this prison over him, Sukuna was doing whatever he wanted. Yuji thought he was in control, but then he seen the absolute power and devastation that Sukuna brought forth within Shibuya, and this was only a fraction. This was only something slight. This information directly feeds back into Yuji, and this starts to warp his mental and emotional perception rather heavily, all because Sukuna is the actual person in control, but is playing at his own game, is biding his own time, and honestly just relaxing. It works so well for the story, especially the more you play him in the background and make him unpredictable, because you don't want to devalue Yuji, and you don't want to devalue Sukuna. So how do you split up their powers, their appreciation, their individuality, even though they are genuinely connected to each other, even though Sukuna is inside of Yuji as a inner demon? That's the hardest thing to make clear, and Akutami does it perfectly. This cause and effect action that comes into play, the fact that Sukuna just does things off whim and honestly just to annoy people or to somewhat please himself. He's very quote-unquote human in that regard. He likes to torment people. He likes to play around and play coy coy and is genuinely very intelligent with his approach. He's not this straight bloodthirsty devilish monster that devours everything in his path. He's picky and choosy and egotistical. It's like developing two characters at the same time, but one has very limited exposure, and even that limited exposure being very purposeful creates that unpredictable aura where you don't know what he wants or what he's doing or what he's planning, which makes it scary. So where does it lead from here? We've had some beautiful showcases of him within the story. We've seen the effects on Yuji and how he's trying his best to handle it, and they've come so far. But what about the end of the story? Does Sukuna being born back into the world bring an end to everything? Does he clash with Gojo? Does he clash with the Magarama thing that Megami has, or another extremely powerful curse similar to that thing Megami has? Does he clash with potentially the final form of Kenjaku, this godly, almighty, all-knowing being that would technically be transcended past anything that we have seen so far? Does Sukuna come out within the culling games? Does something change within there? There's a lot of variables, a lot of options when it comes to him, and the more I think about a clash with Sukuna, the more I think about how much death and destruction that it will bring, and how it will most likely be a final fight, or at least the final fight within the entirety of the story. I do think we'll get a couple of more interactions with Sukuna, potentially exploring more about himself within the culling games, and him most likely fighting some people, maybe some that come from 1,000 years ago, maybe some that he knows, maybe some that he really wants to fight. But when it comes to the finale, when it comes to him being reborn, can he really lose is the bigger question. Sukuna is borderline immortal. They tried absolutely everything and they still couldn't kill him. They had to cut up his body into multiple pieces and scatter them across the globe. This was from a long time ago. Would the powers now be enough to destroy Sukuna, or would he still technically be immortal against all of them, even though we have people like Yuta and Gojo and whatever Kenjaku may potentially become? Even then, the fight that he will bring forth is something else entirely, and if he does actually fight Gojo, I would assume it would be very close to the end of the story, if not one of the biggest final fights within the story. Because a clash between them two would be out of this world, quite literally. These are two beings that are the peak of their respected fields, and we have not seen either of them at their peak. We have not seen them go all out and fight like their life is on the line. We've seen a very raw and early version of Gojo against Toji, but this was before his prime. This was before his power. Thinking about that now is the reason why I made that video a couple of weeks back surrounding Gojo and him potentially channeling that same energy, that same monstrous mental state of just being upset with everything and thriving within the want of destroying everyone that has crossed paths with him. The same could be said with Sukuna. We know he has a different form. We know he has weapons that we haven't seen yet. We have seen on the cover page, but whether or not he'll actually get them within the story, I'm not entirely sure. But we don't even know his abilities, really. We don't know how high they scale or where they come from or what the technicality behind his abilities are. We know they're very powerful. We know he destroys people with ease and potentially has some sort of mimic ability, but then again, even that is unstable. We don't know the semantics behind that. The knife and cleave thing that he has is ridiculous, but how high does that scale? Does it cut through everything? Could it cut through Gojo's Limitless? If for whatever reason he does have some sort of mimic when it comes to Jogo and that interaction and his fire, could he mimic anything from Gojo? Do you see what I kind of mean when I say that Sukuna is genuinely a unpredictable person even at the end of the story? Normally you would want to lead him down a path of he'll most likely just lose, but I honestly don't know. And that's not to say that he would evidently win either against the main cast of the story or against everyone that he goes up against, but even if he doesn't die, he still technically wins. He still has a chance to come back and get resurrected, just like how Jujutsu Kaisen started. But then again, Kenjaku does play an anomaly. If he does become a being very similar to Tengen, even the next version of him, and transcends that, he may be able to wipe everything completely. He may be able to push the world through an evolutionary process that is very drastic and detrimental, trying to expand the barriers further or potentially get rid of them completely because of that evolution. Thing is, once those barriers get tampered with, which is most likely going to happen, and however Kenjaku tends to approach it, a lot of things change. A lot of weird questions come into play. There is a timeline in the back of my head, a very loose one, where by the end of the story, the potential of a world that has no sorcery, no cursed energy whatsoever is actually a thing. This would kind of get rid of every sort of power, every sort of barrier, every sort of powerful curse that has ever existed. But obviously this would only come through with Kenjaku and him changing the value of what cursed energy is. If that gets potentially interrupted, or once again he evolves it, you never know where it goes. What he's doing is kind of shaping the world. He's shaping the future of Jujutsu, of sorcery, of cursed energy specifically. So where does it go? How does that affect Sukuna? Would that be the only way he actually dies, or would it turn him into something else entirely? Would it revert him back to the human state that he was? I think that's the most interesting part of it as well, is that from our knowledge, our very small understanding of his past, he was a human that evolved into a curse. In that sense, Toji is like a half reversed version of him. Someone that has a heavenly restriction that broke the restriction because he bathed in the blood of curses and how much he killed them. So he broke the shackles of fate, quote unquote, and became this anomaly. Sukuna is also technically an anomaly. We don't know the intricate details of how he became a curse, how that evolutionary process happened. We don't know if Sukuna is technically two different people because he has 4 arms and 2 faces and 2 mouths, or if he himself is split into 2 people. I don't know if that makes sense, but there is a lot of variety that comes with Sukuna. His future, how he plays in the story, and his outcome. It's hard to think that he's going to lose anytime soon, even by the end of the story, so I am extremely excited to see what Akutami does, because I've been loving how they've decided to play upon them, that he isn't a major presence constantly. For how powerful and overwhelming he technically should be, keeping his presence low-key and unknown and unpredictable is one of the most impressive things. And I'm more than fascinated to see how Akutami capitalizes on all of that. How do they bring it out and show it in all of its glory? The true and final form of Sukuna, the most powerful curse to ever exist. So with that being said, that is basically it. Let me know how you feel about Sukuna as a character. A lot of people may not even care about him because of how much he's actually played upon within the story, but you also may love the fact that he adds such an unpredictable nature to the story. I'd love to hear your thoughts. With that said, however, I want to thank you all for watching. Leave a like and subscribe if you enjoyed. I greatly appreciate it. Drink plenty of water. New video every 3 days, and I will see you within the next one. Goodbye.